The dust cloud rose behind her carriage like a sunset ghost, and Nora Graham knew she was either riding toward salvation or straight into the biggest mistake of her life. The wheels rattled over the hardened earth of southeastern California, every jostle reminding her that Boston was 3,000 miles behind her now, along with everything she had ever known. It was June of 1884, and the desert heat pressed down on her like a physical weight, making her fine cotton dress cling uncomfortably to her skin. She had left civilization, left propriety, left the disappointed faces of her family, who could not understand why a 23-year-old woman of good breeding would throw away a perfectly respectable marriage proposal to chase a half-remembered promise made by a stranger. But Nathan Nichols had not been a stranger, not really. 3 months ago, he had been the most real thing in her carefully constructed world. The driver, an older Mexican man named Esteban who had agreed to take her from the railway station in San Bernardino all the way to Quartz Hill, called back to her. "We are close now, Miss Graham. You see those peaks? The town is just beyond." Nora leaned forward, squinting against the brilliant sunlight. The mountains rose jagged and stark against the endless blue sky, their surfaces glittering with the quartz deposits that gave the town its name. Somewhere in that collection of buildings ahead was the man who had walked into her father's hotel in Boston, tracking mud and bringing with him the smell of leather and open spaces. He had been there on business, something about selling cattle to eastern markets, and she had been manning the front desk because her father believed in his children learning the family trade from the ground up. Nathan had looked at her for exactly 3 seconds before saying, "Well, aren't you a sight?" She should have been offended. Instead, she had laughed. The memory made her chest tight now. They had spent 5 days together. 5 days of stolen conversations and walks through Boston Common. 5 days where he told her about California, and the ranch he was building, and the sky so wide it made you believe in possibilities. She had told him about feeling trapped, about the expectations that pressed down on her like stones, about wanting something more than a life of managing linens and greeting guests with a practiced smile. On the 5th day, he had kissed her behind the stables, and it had felt like falling and flying at the same time. On the 6th day, he was gone. No goodbye, no explanation. Just a room cleaned out and a bill settled in full. Her father had shrugged when she asked, saying that cattlemen were unreliable folk always moving on. But Nathan had left something behind, something the cleaning girl found tucked into the frame of the mirror. A note, just 3 words in rough handwriting. "I'll be waiting." It had not been signed. It had not needed to be. For 3 months, she tried to forget. She accepted the courtship of Daniel Whitmore, a banker's son with soft hands and sensible plans. She attended parties and smiled at the right times and pretended that her heart had not galloped away west on horseback. But then Daniel had proposed over dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston, and instead of joy, she had felt only a suffocating certainty that if she said yes, she would spend the rest of her life wondering what if. The next morning, she had bought a train ticket. Now here she was, arriving unannounced in a town she had never seen, looking for a man who might not remember her name, carrying nothing but 2 trunks, and a stubborn conviction that sometimes you had to chase the thing that scared you most. Quartz Hill materialized out of the heat shimmer like something from a dream. It was smaller than she had imagined, a main street of perhaps 20 buildings flanked by scattered houses and corrals. Everything looked sun-bleached and temporary, as if a strong wind might carry it all away. Esteban guided the horses down the rutted main road, past a general store, a saloon with a crooked sign, a building marked as the assayer's office. Curious faces turned to watch them pass. A woman in a faded calico dress paused in sweeping her porch. Two men loading supplies onto a wagon stopped their work to stare. "Where would you like me to take you, miss?" Esteban asked. That was the question, wasn't it? She had no idea where Nathan lived or even if he was still in Quartz Hill. He could have moved on months ago. He could be married. He could have been married then, for all she knew, just amusing himself with a naive hotel keeper's daughter before returning to his real life. "Is there a hotel?" she asked, her voice smaller than she would have liked. "The boarding house." Esteban pointed with his chin toward a two-story structure that looked sturdier than most of the others. "Mrs. Patterson runs it. She will have a room for you." As they drew closer, Nora saw a man standing outside the boarding house, one boot propped against a post, hat tilted low against the sun. Something in the way he stood made her breath catch, a recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to her bones. The man straightened as their carriage approached, pushing his hat back, and she saw his face clearly. Nathan Nichols. Older somehow, though it had only been 3 months. More weathered, but unmistakably him. Esteban pulled the horses to a stop, and for a moment nobody moved. The desert wind kicked up dust devils in the street. Somewhere a dog barked. Nathan took a step forward, then another. His eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her forget the heat, the dust, the impossibility of what she had done. She stood up in the carriage, her legs unsteady, and found her voice. "I know I should have sent word, but I've been waiting," Nathan said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, rough and warm like sun-heated stone. The simplicity of it hit her like a physical blow. Not "what are you doing here?" or "I'm surprised to see you." Just those 3 words that matched the note he had left, as if he had known all along that she would come, as if he had been standing on this street every day for 3 months waiting for her carriage to appear. Esteban cleared his throat. "Should I unload the trunks, miss?" Nathan moved to the side of the carriage and held up his hand to help her down. When her gloved fingers touched his bare palm, she felt the calluses, the strength, the steadiness of him. She stepped down carefully, her traveling boots raising small clouds of dust, and found herself standing close enough to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "You left," she said, because it was the accusation that had burned in her chest for 3 months. "I had to," he said simply. "Your father made it clear I wasn't good enough for you. He was probably right. But I couldn't leave without giving you a choice, even if it was a choice you'd never take. You thought I wouldn't come." Something complicated crossed his face. "I hoped you would. I prayed you would. But I figured a woman like you would have better sense." "I've never been very sensible," Nora said. And then she was crying, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and Nathan was pulling her against his chest, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, and she felt the thunder of his heartbeat against her ear. "Thank God for that," he whispered into her hair. Behind them, Esteban was diplomatically studying the horizon. A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance, the kind of audience that appeared whenever anything interesting happened in a small town. Nora pulled back enough to look up at Nathan, suddenly aware of how this must look, how scandalous it was by any standard she had been raised with. "I don't have anywhere to stay," she said. "I was going to get a room here and then try to find you." "You'll stay at my ranch," Nathan said immediately. Then, seeing her expression, he added, "I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen. She's been with me since I bought the place. It'll be proper enough and you'll be more comfortable than in town." "You have a housekeeper?" Something about this detail delighted her, this evidence of his real life, the things he had not mentioned in their 5 days together. "I have a lot of things to tell you," he said. "But first, let's get you out of this sun before you melt clean through. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the boarding house, a stout woman with sharp eyes and an appraising look. "Nathan Nichols, are you causing a scene in front of my establishment?" "No, madam," Nathan said with exaggerated politeness. "Just retrieving what's mine." "I am not yours," Nora said automatically, but she was smiling when she said it. "Not yet," Nathan agreed. "But you came 3,000 miles, so I figure I've got a fighting chance." Mrs. Patterson looked between them and shook her head. "Young people." "Well, don't just stand there letting the whole town gawk. Get her somewhere decent." Nathan paid Esteban for the journey and arranged for the trunks to be loaded onto his wagon. Nora found herself being guided toward a sturdy buckboard while half the town watched with undisguised interest. She caught fragments of whispered conversation. "Boston, I heard, and just showed up like that, and always knew Nathan would find himself someone." The wagon ride to Nathan's ranch took 20 minutes, following a track that wound through scrubland dotted with Joshua trees and yucca. The landscape was so different from Massachusetts that it might as well have been another planet, all harsh angles and muted colors, beautiful in a way that took your breath rather than gave it. Nathan drove in silence, occasionally glancing over at her as if to confirm she was really there. Finally, Nora spoke. "Tell me why you left without saying goodbye." His hands tightened on the reins. "Your father caught me before dawn that last morning, told me he knew men like me, drifters playing at being ranchers, and that his daughter was destined for better things. He offered me $500 to disappear without seeing you again." "He what?" Anger flared hot in her chest. "I told him he could keep his money, but he was right that you deserved better than a cattleman with more debts than cattle. So I left the note because I'm a coward who couldn't resist leaving the door open just a crack, and then I came back here and worked like a man possessed. I bought out my partner's share of the ranch. I hired more help. I made deals with merchants in San Bernardino. I've been building something real, something solid enough that maybe you wouldn't be giving up everything for nothing. You did that in 3 months. I did that for 3 months, he corrected. The possibility of you kept me going when the work got hard. Every fence I fixed, every head of cattle I moved, I thought maybe this would be enough. Maybe I could build something worthy of a woman brave enough to cross a continent on a hope. Nora's throat was tight. I broke off my engagement 2 weeks ago. Daniel proposed and I said I needed time to think, and then I realized I wasn't thinking about him at all. I was thinking about you, about that last afternoon when you told me about this place. You said the stars at night were so bright they looked close enough to touch. They are, Nathan said. I'll show you tonight. The ranch appeared around a bend, and Nora felt her breath catch. It was not grand, but it was real and solid, exactly as he had described. A low house built of adobe and wood, a barn that looked new, corrals holding perhaps 30 horses, and beyond that, grazing land stretching toward the mountains. Cattle dotted the landscape, dark shapes against the pale earth. It's beautiful, she said and meant it. It's home, Nathan said. Or it could be if you wanted. A Chinese woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with gray threading through her black hair and an expression of polite curiosity. "Mr. Nichols, you brought a guest. Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Nora Graham from Boston. She'll be staying with us for a while. Nora, this is Mrs. Chen, who keeps this place from falling into complete chaos." Mrs. Chen's eyes sharpened with understanding, and something that might have been approval crossed her face. "The lady from Boston. I will prepare the guest room." "You told her about me?" Nora asked as Mrs. Chen disappeared back inside. Nathan climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her. "I might have mentioned you once or twice. Every day. Sometimes twice a day." He lifted her down, his hand spanning her waist, and for a moment they stood close together in the yard, the afternoon sun painting everything gold. "I should have sent a letter," Nora said. "This is completely improper. I just showed up on your doorstep like some kind of desperate woman." "Are you desperate?" Nathan asked, and there was no mockery in his voice, just genuine curiosity. She thought about it seriously. "No, I'm certain. That's different." "Yeah," he said softly. "It is." He showed her around the property as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. The barn smelled of hay and horses, comfortable and clean. He introduced her to his hands, two brothers named Miguel and Carlos who worked the cattle, and a young man named Tom who was learning the trade. Everyone was polite, but clearly curious about the Eastern woman in the impractical dress, who had appeared out of nowhere. They walked past the corrals to a slight rise where you could see the whole valley spread out below. Nathan pointed out the boundaries of his land, the water sources that made the difference between success and failure in this dry country, the places where he hoped to expand. "It's not Boston," he said eventually. "Thank God for that," Nora replied, echoing his earlier words. He turned to look at her fully, and she saw the vulnerability beneath his sun-weathered confidence. "I need to know what you're thinking, Nora. Did you come here just to see if what we had was real? Because I can respect that. You can stay as long as you need to figure things out. But I need to know if there's a chance you might stay, or if I should be preparing myself for you to leave." Nora reached out and took his hand, feeling the rough warmth of it. "In Boston, I felt like I was living in a house with all the curtains drawn. Like I could see glimpses of light around the edges, but I could never quite reach it. And then you showed up and threw open all the doors and windows at once, and suddenly I could breathe. When you left, the house felt darker than it ever had before." "That's not really an answer," Nathan said, but his fingers had tightened around hers. "I'm not going back to Boston," she said clearly. "Not to live. I might need to visit eventually to collect the rest of my things and try to explain to my family, but my life is not there anymore. I know it's too soon to talk about forever, but I'm not here on a visit, Nathan. I'm here because this is where I'm supposed to be." The kiss was different from the one behind the Boston stables. That had been tentative, questioning. This was a promise, a seal on a decision already made. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle despite their roughness, and she rose on her toes to meet him, tasting dust and desire and home. When they finally broke apart, the sun was touching the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked impossible. "I should warn you," Nathan said, his forehead still resting against hers. "Life out here isn't easy. The work is hard. The weather is harsh. We're 20 miles from anything resembling culture. You'll be trading symphony halls for coyotes howling at night." "I hate symphony halls," Nora said. "They're always too hot and the seats are uncomfortable and everyone is just there to be seen. Give me coyotes any day," he laughed, the sound warm and relieved. "You say that now." "I'll say it in a year too," she promised. "In 5 years, in 50 years. I'm going to hold you to that." They walked back to the house as darkness fell, and Nathan was right about the stars. They emerged one by one, and then in cascades, more stars than Nora had ever imagined existed, spreading across the sky in a river of light. She stood in the yard with her head tilted back, struck speechless by the vast beauty of it. Mrs. Chen called them in for dinner, and they sat at a simple wooden table eating beef stew and fresh bread. Nathan told her about the daily rhythm of ranch life, the seasonal drives to market, the constant challenges of weather and predators and simple survival. She told him about her journey west, the changing landscape outside the train window, the moment somewhere in Kansas when she realized she was not nervous anymore, just impatient to arrive. "Your father is going to come looking for you," Nathan said eventually. You know that, right? A man like that doesn't just let his daughter disappear. Let him come, Nora said with more confidence than she felt. I'm 23 years old. He can't force me back. He can make things difficult. Then things will be difficult. She met his eyes across the table. Do you want me to leave? No, he said immediately. God, no, I just need you to understand what you're choosing. This won't be easy. Nothing worth having ever is, she said, Mrs. Chen showed her to the guest room, a simple space with a bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out toward the mountains. Her trunks had been brought up, and someone had placed a pitcher of water and a basin on the dresser. It was nothing like her room in Boston with its wallpaper and fine furniture, but it felt more welcoming than that room ever had. She changed into her nightgown and sat by the window, watching the stars and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night. She could hear Nathan moving around in another room, the low murmur of him talking to Mrs. Chen. Eventually, the house settled into silence. Nora lay in bed, certain she would be too excited to sleep, and was unconscious within minutes. She woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon drifting up from below. For a moment, she was disoriented, unable to place where she was. Then memory returned in a rush, and with it, a flutter of nerves. In the certainty of last night, she had made grand declarations. But morning brought questions. What exactly was she doing here? What happened next? She dressed in one of her simpler day dresses and went downstairs to find Nathan already gone. Mrs. Chen was in the kitchen, a room filled with the warmth of the stove. Mr. Nichols is checking the south fence, Mrs. Chen said, pouring coffee without being asked. He will be back for lunch. You are to make yourself comfortable. I don't want to be in the way, Nora said, Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. You are not in the way. Sit. Eat. I will teach you things you need to know. Over breakfast, Mrs. Chen explained the realities of ranch life with brisk efficiency. Water was precious and not to be wasted. Snakes were a danger. You checked your boots before putting them on. The nearest town was Quartz Hill, but for serious supplies, you went to San Bernardino once a month. The ranch hands were good men, but they had lost the last housekeeper to marriage 6 months ago, so things had become rather rough. Mr. Nichols needs a wife, Mrs. Chen said bluntly. A ranch this size needs a woman's hand, but not just any woman, someone strong, someone who will not break when things are hard. I'm stronger than I look, Nora said. Mrs. Chen studied her with sharp eyes. We will see. Come. I will show you the kitchen garden. If you stay, you will need to know these things. The next hours passed in a flurry of information. The garden where they grew vegetables and herbs, the chickens that provided eggs, the spring house where they kept things cool, the complicated system for laundry in a place where water was scarce. Nora's head spun with it all, but she paid attention, asking questions, committing details to memory. Nathan returned at midday, dusty and tired but smiling when he saw her in the garden with dirt under her fingernails. I see Mrs. Chen is putting you to work already. I'm learning, Nora said, standing and brushing off her skirt. Did you know there are 17 different ways to die from snakebite out here? Mrs. Chen is exaggerating. There are only about 12. He was teasing, and she swatted his arm, which made him laugh. Come walk with me. There's something I want to show you. He led her away from the house, following a trail that wound through rocky outcroppings. The sun was brutal, and she was grateful for the bonnet Mrs. Chen had insisted she wear. After 20 minutes, they reached a spot where water trickled from between rocks, forming a small pool before disappearing into the earth. This is the spring that makes everything possible, Nathan said. Without this water, none of this would work. When I first found this property, I spent 3 days just sitting here, trying to decide if I believed in it enough to stake everything I had. In the end, I figured faith was cheaper than regret. Nora knelt by the water, trailing her fingers through it. Is that what I am? A leap of faith? No, Nathan said. You're the thing that makes the faith worthwhile. She looked up at him, this man she barely knew and somehow knew completely. We should probably talk about practical things, expectations, plans. Probably, he agreed, settling onto a rock beside the pool. What do you want to talk about first? What happens now? I can't just live in your guest room indefinitely. It's already improper enough. Nathan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. In Boston, I would have courted you properly. Called on you with flowers, taken you to dinner, asked your father for permission. But we're not in Boston, and your father already made his feelings clear. Out here, things are simpler. If you're sure about me, if you think you could build a life in this place, then we get married. Simple as that. Simple, Nora repeated, though her heart was racing. Or you can take your time, he added quickly. Stay as long as you need to be certain. I'm not trying to rush you, I just want you to know where I stand. I knew what I wanted the second day I saw you in that hotel, when you laughed at some terrible joke I made. I spent 3 months working toward being worthy of you. Now you're here, and I'm not going to pretend I want anything other than forever. What if I'm not who you think I am? The fear came out before she could stop it. What if you've built me up in your head and the reality is disappointing? He reached out and took her hand. What if the same is true for you? What if I'm not the adventure you were hoping for, just a cattleman with dirt under his nails and a hardscrabble ranch? You're not, she said immediately. Then maybe we trust that we see each other clearly, he said. I'm not expecting you to be perfect, Nora. I'm expecting you to be real. Can you accept the same from me? She thought about the question seriously. In Boston, she had been surrounded by people performing elaborate social dances, everyone playing roles. Here, stripped of all that pretense, she could either hide behind old habits or choose something different. I want to marry you, she said, and watched his eyes widen. But I need a little time, not to decide about you, but to learn how to be useful here. I don't want to be a burden you took on because I showed up dramatically. I want to be a partner. You could never be a burden, Nathan said. Give me 2 weeks, she said. Let me learn the ranch, learn what needs doing. Let me prove to myself that I can handle this life, and then ask me again. Something complicated crossed his face, a mixture of disappointment and respect. 2 weeks, but I'm going to be making my case the whole time. I would expect nothing less, she said, and sealed it with a kiss that left them both breathless in the desert sun. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest and most satisfying of Nora's life. She woke before dawn and fell into bed exhausted each night. Mrs. Chen was a patient but exacting teacher, showing her how to manage the household in an environment where nothing was easy or taken for granted. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental oven, to preserve food, to stretch supplies, to cook meals for hungry ranch hands who came in from long days of brutal work. Nathan kept his word about making his case, but he did it through actions rather than words. He taught her to ride, spending patient hours in the corral as she learned to handle the gentle mare he had chosen for her. He showed her the boundaries of the ranch, explaining the work with an enthusiasm that made even fence repair sound interesting. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing, building the foundation of real knowing that courtship usually took months to establish. She met the challenges head-on. When a rattlesnake appeared in the chicken coop, she killed it herself with a hoe, hands shaking but determined. When a violent thunderstorm rolled through, she helped secure everything that might blow away, getting soaked and muddy in the process. When Tom, the young ranch hand, was thrown from his horse and broke his arm, she helped set it with steady hands while he bit down on a leather strap. The other ranch hands slowly accepted her presence. Miguel's wife, Rosa, came to visit and declared that it was about time Nathan found someone sensible. The town of Quartz Hill buzzed with gossip about the Boston woman at the Nichols ranch. But when Nora accompanied Nathan to town for supplies, she met the speculation with a level gaze and polite greetings that won over more people than elaborate explanations would have. On the 10th day, a letter arrived from Boston. Her father's handwriting was unmistakable on the envelope. Nora took it to her room and read it alone, her stomach tight with anxiety. The letter was everything she had feared: disappointment, anger, accusations of foolishness and impropriety. Her father demanded she return immediately. He threatened to come out and retrieve her himself. He said she was throwing away her future for a fantasy. Nora read it twice, then sat at the small desk in her room and wrote a reply. She kept it simple and honest. She was staying. She was sorry for the pain she was causing, but she was building a life that felt true in a way nothing in Boston ever had. She hoped he would eventually understand and forgive her, but she would not return. She asked him to ship the rest of her belongings and to give her love to her mother and siblings. She sealed the letter before she could second-guess herself and gave it to Nathan to post the next time he went to town. "Was it bad?" he asked, seeing her face. "It was expected," she said. "He's angry. He'll stay angry for a while, but he loves me enough that eventually he'll come around, I hope." Nathan pulled her into his arms and she let herself lean into his strength. "I'm sorry, this is my fault." "No," she said firmly. "This is my choice. He needs to understand that." On the 14th evening, Nora realized she had stopped counting days. The rhythm of ranch life had become her rhythm. She knew which chickens were good layers and which were troublemakers. She could read the sky for weather signs. She had opinions about irrigation and fence placement. Her hands had blisters that were forming calluses, and her skin had taken on a golden tan despite her best efforts with bonnets. She found Nathan in the barn, checking on a mare about to foal. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him straighten immediately. "2 weeks," she said, "has it been?" He was playing innocent, but the tension in his shoulders gave him away. "You know it has. You've probably been counting the hours." "Minutes," he admitted. "I've been counting minutes." Nora crossed the barn floor, hay crunching under her feet, until she stood directly in front of him. "I've learned a lot in 2 weeks. How to make bread without burning it, mostly. How to tell the difference between a king snake and a coral snake. How to sit a horse without falling off." "You're a fast learner," Nathan said, his voice carefully neutral. "But the most important thing I learned," she continued, "is that I was wrong." She saw him brace himself, saw the fear flash across his face, and rushed to continue. "I thought I needed 2 weeks to prove I could handle this life. But that's not really what I was doing. I was giving myself permission to want this without guilt. I was proving to myself that choosing you wasn't running away from Boston, it was running toward something better. And," he barely breathed the word, "and I don't need any more time. I love you, Nathan Nichols. I think I loved you from the moment you walked into my father's hotel covered in trail dust and grinning like you owned the world. I definitely loved you when you left that note, even though it drove me crazy for 3 months. And now, after these 2 weeks, I love you enough to know that anywhere you are is where I want to be." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of the relief of waiting finally over. When they broke apart, he was laughing. "I have something for you. I was going to wait until you were ready, but I've been carrying it around for days like a fool." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was simple silver set with a piece of polished turquoise, clearly made by local hands rather than some fancy Eastern jeweler. "It's not much," he said, But the turquoise came from these mountains, and I thought that mattered more than diamonds from somewhere else. "It's perfect," Nora said, her voice thick with tears. "Ask me. Nora Graham, will you marry me? Will you take on this ranch and this rough life and me, with all my flaws and limitations? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the fact that you crossed a continent to find me?" "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it, on one condition. Anything. Stop saying you're not worthy. We're worthy of each other. Equal partners, remember, equal partners," he agreed and slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They were married 3 days later in Quartz Hill's small church. Mrs. Chen stood as witness, along with Rosa and Miguel and half the town who showed up out of curiosity, and stayed because the happiness was infectious. The minister was a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, which everyone agreed was either providential timing or excellent luck. Nora wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her alter from one of her Boston gowns, removing the elaborate bustle and ornaments until it was something practical enough for the occasion but still lovely. Nathan wore his best clothes, his dark hair slicked back, his hands scrubbed clean though no amount of scrubbing could remove the evidence of work from his calluses and the deep tan of his skin. They spoke their vows in strong, clear voices, both of them meaning every word with an intensity that made even the most cynical townsperson blink back emotion. When the minister pronounced them married, Nathan kissed her thoroughly enough to scandalize the church ladies and delight everyone else. The reception was held at the saloon, which had been hastily cleaned for the occasion. Someone had a fiddle, someone else had a guitar, and before long there was music and dancing and food that the whole town had contributed. Mrs. Patterson brought pies. The assayer brought whiskey. Rosa and several other women provided enough food to feed everyone twice over. Nora danced with her new husband, then with Miguel, then with various townspeople who wanted to welcome her officially. Between dances, women pulled her aside with advice, some useful and some contradictory, all of it offered with genuine warmth. The men clapped Nathan on the back and made jokes about married life that made him roll his eyes but smile. As the party wound down and the stars came out, Nathan and Nora slipped away from the celebration. They rode back to the ranch together on Nathan's horse, Nora sitting sideways in front of him, wrapped in his coat against the cooling night air. The sounds of the party faded behind them, replaced by the vast silence of the desert, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a night bird. At the ranch, Mrs. Chen had diplomatically retired to the small cottage behind the main house that served as her quarters. The house was theirs alone for the first time, the guest room designation finally obsolete. Nathan carried Nora over the threshold because she said it seemed important to honor at least one tradition. And then they were alone in the room that was now theirs, not his, facing each other with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. "I've never done this before," Nora said, needing him to know. "Neither have I," Nathan said, which surprised her enough that he laughed. "Did you think I was experienced? I've spent the last 5 years building this ranch. I haven't had time for anything else. And before that, I wasn't interested in anyone I didn't love." The admission settled her nerves. They undressed with fumbling hands and whispered laughter, figuring things out together, learning each other's bodies with patience and growing confidence. It was awkward and tender and absolutely perfect, a claiming that went both ways, a completion that left them tangled together in sheets that smelled of sunshine and sage. Afterward, they lay talking in whispers about nothing important, everything important. Nathan traced lazy patterns on her shoulder. Nora listened to his heartbeat slow toward sleep. Through the window, Those impossible stars watched over them, and the future stretched out full of work and challenge, and the absolute certainty that they would face it together. The first months of marriage were an adjustment for both of them. Learning to share space, to accommodate another person's habits, to communicate about the thousand small decisions that made up daily life. Nathan was neat, but perpetually forgot to clean the mud from his boots before entering the house. Nora was organized but had a tendency to rearrange things in ways that made sense to her, but baffled everyone else. They had their first real fight about whether to buy more cattle or invest in improving the water system, both of them passionate about their position, both eventually realizing they were really arguing about deeper fears about security and risk. They learned to apologize, to compromise, to pick battles that mattered and let go of things that didn't. Mrs. Chen watched with the satisfied air of someone who had predicted success, occasionally offering cryptic advice that usually turned out to be exactly right. Nora threw herself into ranch life with the same determination she had brought to the 2-week trial period. She took over the account books, discovering she had a head for numbers that Nathan lacked. She started a proper kitchen garden, expanding it beyond Mrs. Chen's practical vegetable patch to include herbs and a few flowers that served no purpose except beauty. She learned animal husbandry by doing, helping with difficult births and nursing sick animals and developing opinions about breeding lines. The ranch hands stopped treating her like a fragile Eastern lady and started asking her opinion on things. When Miguel suggested they try breeding some of their horses with better stock to improve quality, Nora researched it thoroughly and presented a plan that impressed even Nathan with its detail. They implemented it, and within a few years, the Nichols Ranch became known for producing excellent working horses. Nathan watched his wife transform from a Boston hotel keeper's daughter into a rancher's wife, who could discuss cattle prices with buyers from San Bernardino and negotiate hard bargains on supplies, and still find time to make the house feel like a home. He fell in love with her again every day, each small discovery of her competence and strength and stubborn determination adding new layers to his adoration. That first winter was harsh, testing everything they had built. Storms rolled in with vicious cold that killed livestock and made simple tasks dangerous. They lost 3 calves to the weather and a section of fence to high winds. Nora learned that suffering through difficulties was different from reading about them, that exhaustion could become a constant companion, that worry could keep you awake even when your body desperately needed sleep. But they survived it together. When a blizzard trapped them in the house for 3 days, they played cards and told stories and made love by the fire. When the weather broke and the work was overwhelming, they divided tasks and supported each other through 18-hour days. When they finally made it through to spring, both of them battered but intact, they understood that they had passed a test that many marriages failed. Spring brought renewal and, unexpectedly, visitors from Boston. Nora's younger sister Teresa arrived on the stage one April morning, chaperoned by an aunt, bringing letters from their mother and a cautious olive branch from their father. Teresa was 21 and engaged to a lawyer, but she had begged to visit before her wedding to see what had drawn Nora away. She stayed for 2 weeks and was completely transformed by the experience. The sister, who arrived in impractical Eastern clothes and delicate sensibilities, left in borrowed ranch attire, sun-browned and full of plans to convince her fiancé to consider opportunities in California. Her letters home apparently caused quite a stir, and their mother wrote to Nora with a mixture of exasperation and reluctant admiration. Their father's letter came separately, stiff and formal, but it acknowledged that Nora seemed happy and Nathan seemed decent, and perhaps he had judged too quickly based on prejudice rather than character. It was not a full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and Nora cried over it for an hour while Nathan held her and said nothing, understanding that sometimes there were no words, just presence. That summer, they made improvements to the ranch that Nathan had been dreaming about for years. They built a new barn with money from a successful cattle sale. They hired 2 more hands as the operation expanded. They invested in better breeding stock for both cattle and horses. And they built an addition onto the house, adding 2 bedrooms and a proper bathing room with a large copper tub that became Nora's favorite luxury. On their first anniversary, they rode out to the spring that Nathan had showed her in the beginning. They had a picnic there, sitting on blankets and eating Mrs. Chen's fried chicken and fresh bread. The day was warm but not brutal, the sky that endless blue that Nora had come to love. "Have you regretted it?" Nathan asked, something he had never quite dared to ask before. Giving up everything for this, Nora considered the question seriously, as she always did when he was brave enough to voice his doubts. "I gave up a life that never fit me for one that does. That's not really a sacrifice. Do I miss some things about Boston? Yes, I miss my family. I miss theaters and bookshops and the ocean, but I wouldn't go back. This is real in a way that life never was." "We could visit," Nathan said. "Maybe next spring after the calving season. Take the train east, see your family, show them you're happy." "You would do that. You hate traveling." "I hate being away from the ranch," he corrected. "But I love you more. And I think I owe your father a conversation man to man now that I've proven I can take care of you." "I can take care of myself," Nora said automatically. "I know," Nathan said. "But he needs to hear that you're thriving, and it might mean more coming from me. Let me have this bit of old-fashioned pride." They did make the trip the following year, a month-long journey that felt strange and wonderful and ultimately reinforced that they had made the right choice. Boston was fascinating to revisit, all its culture and refinement temporarily appealing. But it also felt constrictive, the streets too narrow, the buildings too tall, the expectations too rigid. Nathan was politely bored by the symphony and openly uncomfortable at the formal dinner Nora's father hosted, but the visit accomplished what it needed to. Nora's father shook Nathan's hand and apologized for his initial judgment. Her mother cried and fussed over her daughter who looked so different, so healthy, so genuinely content. Her siblings peppered them with questions about ranch life. And Teresa, now married and somewhat trapped in conventional Boston life, looked at Nora with unconcealed envy. They returned to California with relief, both of them feeling like they had been holding their breath and could finally exhale when the mountains came into view from the train window. Mrs. Chen greeted them with tart comments about the house falling apart without them, though everything was clearly in perfect order. The hands welcomed them back with genuine pleasure. The land itself seemed to welcome them home. That night, lying in their own bed with familiar sounds outside the window, Nathan pulled Nora close and said, "Thank you for coming back here with me." "This is my home," Nora said simply. "It will always pull me back." The years that followed settled into a rhythm of work and weather, growth and occasional setback, the steady building of something that would last. The ranch continued to expand. Their reputation for quality stock spread. They weathered droughts and storms, market downturns, and the occasional disagreement with neighbors over water rights or boundary lines. Through it all, their marriage deepened in the way that good marriages do, becoming less about grand passion and more about steady partnership, though the passion never entirely faded. They learned each other's rhythms and moods. They developed their own traditions and private jokes. They supported each other through losses and celebrated wins together. 2 years after the Boston visit, Nora discovered she was pregnant. The news brought joy mixed with fear, as pregnancy in a remote ranch was not without risks. Nathan became protective to the point of absurdity, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work, which lasted until Nora firmly informed him that she was pregnant, not broken, and would continue managing the ranch as always until such time as it was actually impossible. Mrs. Chen, who had raised 6 children before circumstances brought her to California, became a font of information and practical advice. Rosa, who had 4 children of her own, was equally helpful. Between them, they made sure Nora understood what to expect and how to prepare. The pregnancy was mostly uncomplicated, though the summer heat was oppressive, and Nora grew increasingly uncomfortable as her body changed in ways both amazing and alarming. Nathan hovered and worried and tried very hard not to show how terrified he was of something going wrong. In March of 1887, their son was born in the main bedroom of the ranch house with Mrs. Chen and Rosa attending. It was a long labor that stretched through the night and into the next day. Nathan paced outside the room, periodically trying to come in and being firmly ejected by Mrs. Chen, who said he was underfoot and making Nora nervous. But when the baby finally arrived, howling his displeasure at this new world, Nathan was called in to meet his son. Nora, exhausted and exhilarated, watched her husband hold their baby with shaking hands, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "He's so small," Nathan whispered. "He's actually quite large," Mrs. Chen said dryly. "Nearly 9 pounds. Your wife did excellent work." They named him James, after Nathan's father who had died years before. James Nathan Nichols came into the world healthy and loud and demanding, and their lives reorganized around him immediately. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding, the mysterious crying that defied explanation. But also the fierce love that caught them both by surprise. The way everything else faded in importance compared to this small person they had created. Nora discovered that motherhood suited her better than she had feared. She was practical and unflappable, approaching problems with the same determined competence she brought to everything else. Nathan was gentle and patient with their son, though he remained terrified of somehow breaking him, until James proved his durability by surviving the various minor tumbles and scrapes of infancy. As James grew into a toddler and then a young boy, the ranch continued its steady growth. They bought adjacent land when it became available. They built a schoolhouse in Quartz Hill with several other families, hiring a teacher from San Francisco and establishing a real school for the growing number of children in the area. They added more stock, built better structures, invested in improvements that increased efficiency and profit. Through everything, Nathan and Nora remained partners in the truest sense. They consulted on major decisions. They divided work according to skill and interest rather than rigid gender roles. They disagreed sometimes, but had learned how to fight fairly and resolve issues without resentment. They made time for each other, even when the demands of ranch and child threatened to consume everything. When James was 3, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the fear was less intense, replaced by a more confident anticipation. Their daughter was born in early spring of 1890, an easier labor that had Nathan joking that she was clearly going to be less trouble than her brother. They named her Margaret, after Nora's mother, and called her Maggie from the beginning. Maggie was indeed easier than James had been, a placid baby who slept well and smiled early. James was fascinated by his sister, hovering near her cradle and bringing her toys and generally trying to be helpful in ways that sometimes were, and sometimes decidedly weren't. The ranch house, which had once seemed so spacious, filled with the noise and chaos of family life. The addition they had built now housed the children, and they began planning another expansion to give everyone more space and add a proper study where Nora could manage the increasing paperwork that came with a successful ranching operation. The town of Quartz Hill grew along with their family. More businesses opened. The population increased as people seeking opportunities heard about good land and decent prospects. The wild lawlessness that had characterized the early days of settlement gave way to more organized community structures. They elected a proper mayor and town council. They built a real church to replace the informal meeting space. They even got a newspaper, published weekly by an enthusiastic young man from Sacramento. Nathan became an informal leader in the ranching community, respected for his fairness and practical knowledge. Nora served on the school board and organized charitable efforts for families facing hardship. Together, they helped shape Quartz Hill into a real community rather than just a collection of people existing near each other. Years passed in the way they do when life is full, each day bleeding into the next in a blur of work and family and the thousand small moments that make up a life. James grew into a serious boy who loved horses and wanted to know how everything worked. Maggie developed a stubborn streak and a passionate curiosity about the natural world, collecting rocks and plants and insects with equal enthusiasm. The children grew up knowing their parents' story, the romantic tale of how their mother crossed the continent to find their father, how he had been waiting even though he didn't know she was coming. It became family mythology, told and retold, changing slightly in each telling but always ending the same way. With happiness, with rightness, with the certainty that some things are meant to be. On their 10th anniversary, Nathan and Nora stood on the porch in the evening, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set over the mountains. The ranch stretched around them, everything they had built together, substantial and solid and real. "Do you remember the first day you arrived?" Nathan asked. "You looked so out of place in that traveling dress, covered in dust." "I remember you saying you'd been waiting," Nora said. "I thought it was the most romantic and ridiculous thing I'd ever heard." "It was true, though," Nathan said. "I had been waiting. I just didn't know what I was waiting for until I saw you." "That doesn't make any sense," Nora pointed out, but she was smiling. "Love doesn't always make sense," Nathan said. "Sometimes you just know." Inside the house, Mrs. Chen was preparing dinner. In the yard, James was teaching Maggie how to rope a fence post. In the barn, the evening feeding was underway. The ranch hummed with life and purpose, a machine they had built and maintained through sweat and determination and love. Nora leaned against her husband, his arm coming around her waist in a gesture so familiar it was instinctive. "I would do it again," she said. "Every part of it. The fear, the uncertainty, showing up unannounced on your doorstep." "Best day of my life," Nathan said. "Well, tied with a few others. The day you said yes. The day James was born. The day Maggie arrived. There have been a lot of best days." "We've been lucky," Nora said. "We've been brave," Nathan corrected. "And that's better than luck." The next years brought continued growth for both the family and the ranch. James, at 12, was already riding with the hands and learning the cattle business from the ground up. Maggie, at 9, had declared she was going to be a veterinarian, a profession that barely existed but which seemed perfectly suited to her love of animals and her stubborn determination to understand how everything worked. In 1895, when James was 16 and Maggie 13, Nora discovered she was pregnant again. The news was unexpected, as they had assumed their family was complete. But the surprise pregnancy brought joy rather than worry. This child, another boy they named Robert, arrived healthy and vigorous, the gap in age between him and his siblings meaning he grew up almost as an only child in some ways, doted on by older siblings who were old enough to appreciate him. The ranch prospered through the mid-1890s, despite economic challenges in the wider country. The diverse operation they had built, with both cattle and horses and various other enterprises, provided stability when single-focus ranches struggled. Their reputation for quality and fair dealing meant they had steady customers and good relationships with buyers and suppliers. Nathan, now in his early 40s, had silver threading through his hair and a weathered face that showed the years of hard work and harsh sun. But he was still strong, still vital, still the man who could work alongside his hands all day and still have energy to play with his youngest son in the evening. He had become exactly what he had worked toward: a successful rancher, respected in his community, content in his life. Nora, approaching 40, had grown into herself in ways her younger self could never have imagined. The uncertain girl who had arrived unannounced had become a confident woman who managed a complex business, raised 3 children, and was known throughout the region for her sharp mind and fair dealings. She corresponded regularly with her family back east, all of whom had eventually come to see her choice as wise rather than reckless. Her father, softened by age and grandchildren he met through occasional visits, had even admitted in a letter that perhaps he had been wrong to judge Nathan so harshly. As the new century approached, they began planning for the future in more concrete ways. James would inherit the ranch eventually, though he would need to prove he could manage it rather than simply receiving it. Maggie, against all conventional expectations, was preparing to attend a veterinary college in San Francisco, funded by her parents who believed in education, regardless of gender. Robert was still young enough that his future was unwritten, but already he showed signs of his mother's head for numbers and organization. The turn of the century was celebrated in Quartz Hill with a town party that lasted 2 days. It was a time of optimism, of feeling that the rough pioneer days were behind them and a more prosperous future lay ahead. Nathan and Nora, surrounded by their family and friends, toasted the new century and reflected on how far they had come. The photograph taken that night by the town's amateur photographer captured them standing together in front of their house. Nathan in his best suit, Nora in a dress that was elegant but practical, both of them flanked by their children. James tall and serious, already showing the man he would become. Maggie with her intelligent eyes and determined chin. Robert, small but clearly part of the family unit. Behind them, the house they had expanded twice, the barn Nathan had built himself, the land they had tamed and nurtured. The photograph became a treasured family heirloom, but in the moment it was taken, they were just living their lives, unaware of how their story would be told and retold by descendants who would see it as proof that following your heart, despite fear and uncertainty, could lead to exactly where you needed to be. As the years continued to unfold, Nora and Nathan settled into the comfortable rhythm of a long marriage. They were partners who had weathered storms together, who knew each other's flaws and loved anyway, who could communicate with a glance across a crowded room. They still made each other laugh. They still reached for each other in the night. They still sometimes sat on the porch in the evening and marveled at the life they had built. Their children grew and launched into their own lives. James eventually took over day-to-day management of the ranch, proving himself capable and innovative. He married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring property, expanding their holdings through both the marriage and good business decisions. Maggie finished her schooling and opened a practice treating large animals throughout the region, becoming one of the few female veterinarians in California and earning respect through sheer competence. Robert went to university in San Francisco and became a businessman, though he always came home for important occasions and never lost his connection to the ranch. Grandchildren arrived, filling the house with noise and energy again. Nathan and Nora, now in the roles of grandparents, discovered new joy in watching the next generation grow. They were more patient, less worried, able to enjoy the children without the weight of full responsibility. They told their grandchildren the story of how they met, how Nora had traveled across the country to find Nathan, how he had been waiting even though he didn't know she was coming. The grandchildren always asked the same questions. How did you know? What if grandmother had stayed in Boston? What if you had missed each other? And Nathan would always give the same answer. Some things are meant to be, you just have to be brave enough to chase them. Mrs. Chen remained with them until her death in 1908, having become so integral to the family that they mourned her as deeply as any blood relative. The ranch continued to evolve with the times, adopting new techniques and technologies while maintaining the core values of hard work and fair dealing that Nathan and Nora had established from the beginning. As they moved into their later years, they slowed down but never truly stopped. Nathan still rode out to check the property most days, though usually accompanied by James or one of his sons. Nora still managed the books and correspondence, though she had trained Robert's wife to take over gradually. They attended town meetings and church services, voted in elections and supported community improvements, remained engaged with the world even as their direct participation decreased. On their 30th anniversary, the town held a celebration in their honor, recognizing them as founding pillars of the community. Speeches were made about their contributions, their example, their steadfast partnership. Nathan, embarrassed by the attention, thanked everyone briefly and said only that he had been lucky in one thing above all others, that a brave woman had been willing to take a chance on him. Nora, standing beside him with his hand firmly in hers, corrected him publicly. It wasn't luck. It was love, and it wasn't a chance. It was a certainty. From the moment I decided to come here, I knew it was right. You don't cross a continent on luck, you cross it on faith. The crowd cheered, and Nathan kissed his wife right there in front of everyone. And if some of the younger folks were scandalized by such public affection from people in their 50s, most just smiled at the obvious devotion that hadn't diminished with time. They lived to see the First World War, a distant conflict that seemed impossible in its scale and horror. James's eldest son enlisted despite their fears, and they endured the anxiety of having family in danger. When he returned, wounded but alive, they wept with relief and held him close, understanding again how fragile happiness could be. They lived to see women get the vote, something Nora had never quite believed would happen in her lifetime. She cast her ballot with hands that shook with emotion, thinking of all the women who had fought for this right, grateful to be alive to exercise it. They lived to see automobiles become common, though Nathan never fully trusted them, preferring his horses to the end. They lived to see airplanes, telephones, electric lights in town. The world changed around them at dizzying speed, but their core remained constant: the land, the work, the family, each other. In the spring of 1924, Nathan fell ill with pneumonia. He fought it stubbornly, as he had fought everything in life, but at 70, his body could not overcome it. The family gathered, 3 children and numerous grandchildren filling the house. Nora sat by his bedside, holding his hand as she had held it countless times before. "I've had a good life," Nathan said, his voice weak but clear. "Better than I deserved." "You deserved every bit of it," Nora said fiercely, "and I'm not ready to say goodbye." "Not goodbye," Nathan said. "Just wait for me a while, like I waited for you." He died that evening with his family around him, and Nora's hand in his. The funeral was the largest Quartz Hill had ever seen, people coming from all over the region to pay their respects. He was buried on a hill overlooking the ranch, a spot he had always loved for its view of the whole valley. Nora grieved deeply but not brokenly. She had been shaped by the land and the life they had built, and she had the strength to endure even this. She lived another 8 years, surrounded by family, still sharp and engaged with the world. She saw more grandchildren born, saw the ranch continue to thrive under James's capable management, saw the world keep changing in ways both exciting and troubling. When she died in her sleep in 1932, at the age of 71, her children found a letter she had written to be opened after her death. In it, she had written her own account of that day in June 1884 when she arrived in Quartz Hill, dusty and uncertain, and terrified she had made the biggest mistake of her life. She described seeing Nathan standing outside the boarding house, the way her heart had recognized him before her mind caught up. She described his words, "I've been waiting," and how they had settled something in her soul that had been restless all her life. She ended the letter with advice for her descendants. "Love requires courage. It requires the willingness to look foolish, to risk everything, to step into the unknown. Your grandfather and I were blessed with both love and courage, and from that foundation we built this life you all now share. Never settle for less than the thing that makes your heart race. Never let fear keep you from chasing what matters, and when you find it, hold on tight and never let go. That is the secret to happiness, if there is one." They buried her next to Nathan on the hill overlooking the ranch. Their graves were marked with simple stones bearing their names and years, but the real monument was everything around them. The thriving ranch, the large family, the community they had helped build, the love story that would be told and retold by generations to come. The ranch remained in the family for decades after, each generation adding their own chapters while honoring the foundation Nathan and Nora had laid. The house was expanded again, modernized, but never torn down. The original adobe core remained, a reminder of where everything began. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was right, family members standing on that porch would swear they could feel something in the air, a sense of presence and contentment, as if the love that had filled this place had soaked into the very structure, permanent as the mountains in the distance. The story of how they met became family legend, embroidered with each telling but always true in its essentials. A woman brave enough to cross a continent for love. A man who waited for something he couldn't name until it arrived. The certainty that some things are meant to be, that faith can move you 3,000 miles, that sometimes the biggest risk is the one most worth taking. In the end, Nora had been right. It wasn't luck. It was love and courage. And the willingness to show up unannounced at the doorstep of possibility and see what happened next. What happened next was everything. A life, a partnership, a family, a legacy that would outlast them both and prove that choosing love over fear was never a mistake. The desert that had seemed so harsh and unforgiving when Nora first arrived had become home in the truest sense. The mountains still glittered with quartz in the sunlight. The stars still spread across the night sky in impossible profusion. The spring still bubbled up from between the rocks, providing water that sustained everything they had built. And if you visited that ranch on the right evening, when the light was soft and the breeze carried the scent of sage, you might understand why a young woman in 1884 had looked at this harsh land and seen only possibility. Why a young man had worked himself to exhaustion to build something worthy of her. Why they had chosen each other and never regretted it for a single day of their long lives together. Because some love stories aren't about convenience or practicality or sensible choices. Some love stories are about recognizing your home in another person's eyes, about being brave enough to chase what matters, about showing up unannounced and finding someone who has been waiting all along, even if they didn't know it themselves. That was the story of Nathan and Nora Nichols, pioneers who built a ranch and raised a family, and proved that sometimes the best things in life come from the biggest leaps of faith. Their names were eventually carved into a plaque at the Quartz Hill Town Hall, honoring them as founding families. But the real honor was in the lives they touched, the children and grandchildren who carried their legacy forward, the love story that inspired others to be brave in their own pursuits of happiness. Years after both were gone, their great-granddaughter would stand on that same hill where they were buried and look out over the valley. She would think about the woman she had never met who had crossed a continent alone in 1884, who had shown up unannounced in a strange town looking for a man she had known for only 5 days. She would think about the courage that must have taken, the faith, the absolute certainty that had to exist to take such a risk. And she would understand, perhaps for the first time, that love wasn't just an emotion. It was an action, a choice, a decision to step forward even when the outcome was uncertain. It was showing up. It was waiting, even when you didn't know what you were waiting for. It was building something together that neither could build alone. It was choosing each other every day for 30 years, and never once regretting that choice. That was the legacy Nathan and Nora left behind. Not just land or money or buildings, but an example of what love could be when two brave people decided to reach for it with both hands and never let go. In a world that often felt uncertain and changing too fast, their story remained constant, a reminder that some things, the important things, never really change at all. Love still required courage. Home was still where your heart led you. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you could step off a carriage in a dusty California town and find the person you had been looking for all your life standing there waiting, saying the words you didn't know you needed to hear. "I've been waiting." The end.